Thank you, Dr. Gitlin, for joining us today. We're really excited to offer a conversation on queer mental health. And so we we're hoping that this can be a conversation about queer mental health and what we can do to empower ourselves mentally and emotionally. So thank you, Dr. Gitlin, for joining us. So I'd like to start off with a question. I just came across something in the news last week about the Trevor Project. They had a survey that they did in 2022, and they found that something like 42% of LGBTQ youth considered suicide in the last year, and
Mhm.
over half of transgender and non-binary youth considered suicide. So, given the current political and social climate, what do you, Dr. Gitlin, see the queer community being most concerned about today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be invited to have this discussion with you. Um, it's we are collectively going through some incredibly hard times as a society, um, really across the world. And for folks who come from communities that have been historically marginalized, I think the past several years have been incredibly hard. And when people are feeling individually marginalized within their own homes or their schools, um, I think that that adds to that distress, those feelings of isolation, and really the lack of feeling welcomed or of feeling like you belong in the spaces that are supposed to affirm you and supposed to keep you safe. I think about the fact that so many queer and trans youth have been kind of stuck at home for the past 2 years. And from home, which, obviously there's a huge variety of how safe and affirming the home environment is. But from home, kind of witnessing and hearing about the pandemic, collective loss, folks experiencing loss and grief within their own families. Um, certainly after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and I recently went to a presentation. Dr. Ruth Shim described it as the racial reckoning that wasn't. Where we were kind of collectively experiencing this stress, and also kind of a coming together and a crying out for justice that has been so long delayed and denied for communities of color. And of course, we know that that is not unique to just cisgender and heterosexual folks of color, right? And just seeing systems of injustice continue to perpetuate themselves and not change. And then with more recent legislation being introduced and being passed that restrict the autonomy of trans kids to be affirmed for who they authentically are, for queer and trans kids to talk about their authentic identities and explore identity development in the school environment, to having parents feel threatened with being sued or otherwise kind of coming under surveillance for caring for their gender diverse children. And now, of course, with the forthcoming, we can assume, repeal of Roe v. Wade and the implications that that has, again, for bodily autonomy and people being able to access necessary healthcare when they need it in a timely fashion. And, I just think there's so much weight that so many of our young people are carrying. And when they look into the future and it looks bleak, and also maybe folks are not being affirmed and welcomed for who they authentically are in their everyday lives, I think it's hugely concerning for our mental health as a community.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Um, And so when we examine queer mental health, like what are some of the questions that we all should be asking ourselves first?
Yeah. I I think we need to really look within and look in the past and think about what are some of those earliest messages, those earliest biases that we may have internalized about LGBTQ plus folks. And of course, where you grew up and who you grew up around and when you grew up makes a huge difference in this. But I think, for example, the messages that I remember hearing about, well, I don't remember hearing any messages about trans folks when I was, very young. And then, when I started to um, be exposed more and more just through mainstream media, anti-transgender bias in the media. If anybody here hasn't seen Disclosure, by the way, I highly, highly recommend it. So you can really start to do some of that reflection about the messages you may have internalized from media you've seen. But um, just thinking about who was I exposed to, what kinds of lived experiences did I learn about, whose lived experiences did I never hear about until maybe I was older, and then it felt like there was something new coming my way, but really it was just I hadn't been exposed to it. So I think really reflecting on what are some of the biases that we have about, for example, same gender parents, same gender marriage, about polyamory, about trans identities, about bisexuality, within the beautiful and vast spectrum of the LGBTQ plus umbrella. There are even lots of biases held within the community toward certain subgroups within our umbrella. So I think really reflecting on what those early biases are, and then what are some of the things I currently believe or maybe have some biases about that might be shaping the way I think about other folks or interact with other people.
Biases in really examining the biases that we have and the biases that we face in the larger community. I think that's just really critical to examine and explore. I know I have them, and I think part of the work that we all have to do is to make sure that we are aware of our biases because you know I, when I when I hear somebody say they don't have any biases, I'm like, you do. We all do. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Um, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on like the current concerns in queer mental health. I mean, I'm 57 years old. I came out when I was in my 20s, and I remember thinking in my lifetime that we would never see same-sex marriage. We would never see, gay rights being championed to the degree that it is today. And yet, at the same time, um, I'm painfully aware that the fight is not over, and
Mm-hmm.
um, and now the fight is expanding. We're trying to protect our transgender youth and adults, as well as everybody else. So it just seems like an ongoing battle. And
Mm-hmm.
I think with that, and I'm no psychologist, but I think it feels to me like the battle, it has like a fatigue factor to it. Like you just feel
Mm.
like it's ongoing. When is it going to end? So my question to you is like right now, what are the current concerns in queer mental health for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, the whole rainbow?
Yeah. Well, you named I think the biggest one at the beginning of our conversation, which was the really terrifying rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts among queer and trans folks, really of all ages. I mean, you cited the most recent statistic about youth from the Trevor Project. We also know that 40% of trans adults, 40% report having attempted to end their life at some point during their lifetime. That's compared with 5% of the US population. So again, 40% versus 5% of the general US population. So, I mean, that statistic is just staggering to me. Um, we also know that youth during the pandemic in general, that LGBTQ plus youth did not necessarily feel like their home was an affirming or a safe environment for them. We know that among adults, that LGBTQ adults, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer adults, are generally more likely to have a mental health diagnosis than heterosexual adults, and that those diagnoses are more likely to be more acute, more severe, and longer lasting. And there are some really important kind of frameworks that we can use to understand why this happens, that it's not because there's anything inherently pathological about being a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I think this really calls for us to look at these inequities and these disparities through the lens of trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed systems of care, and through a framework called the Minority Stress Framework that was founded by a psychiatric epidemiologist named Dr. Elon Meyer, actually at UCLA. And what Elon Meyer talks about is, in addition to the daily stresses of, just being a human being who's alive and trying to get through this thing called life, that when you have one or more social identities that are associated with historical or current marginalization, oppression, or discrimination, there are additional daily stressors that you experience in navigating a world that is hostile to you, hostile to your community, hostile to people who look like you. And when folks are navigating these additional stressors, this additional hostility on a daily basis, that stress really builds up over time. And that impacts, certainly just, depression, anxiety, the way we see ourselves, our self-concept, et cetera. It also impacts some of the strategies that we choose to employ to keep ourselves feeling okay. And so sometimes we'll start developing patterns or certain practices that in the short term work for us. Things like isolating if you're feeling unsafe or you're feeling rejected, or using substances, either because you're in an environment where that's just happening as part of the social activity, the social fabric, and or to feel good, to feel better, to ease pain, right? And so we know that these patterns and practices work in the short term. That's why people use them. And then over time, that in addition to the systemic discrimination and inequities that we see that make it hard to access care and hard to live a life that's fulfilling and resource and well lived, that those two forces together come together to start to build up some of these disparities that we see.
You touched on something that made me realize, like there's intersectionality. And so when you have I queer people come in all colors and stripes and um, races, how do you feel when when it's like you've got race, color, gender, sexual orientation, abilities, all those things combined, and queer people may have more than one intersection. I'm not sure if I'm using the term correctly, but when, like you said, when you add up all the stretchers, there's an enormous amount of stretch that the queer community is facing. Um, like what is your, what would you have to say to people who are facing discrimination on more than one level? It's like, how do they work through that, and how do they separate, and how do they basically work through it?
Yeah. Well, I think I kind of think about this in a two-pronged way. The first is, I have to admit, my first response is, um, you know, it is for the systems of power to work through, right? I mean, the person experiencing oppression and discrimination, of course, is the one experiencing the pain, experiencing the suffering, and there's certainly, you know, ways that we can talk about easing pain, right? If not doing away with it. And I think it is really a call to our systems and our governments to reduce the fact that that's even happening in the first place. Um, and, you know, I think thinking about this intersectionally is so critically important because so often, you know, liberation movements are kind of pitted against one another, and we forget the fact that there are so many folks who have intersecting identities where they have a stake in multiple games, right? And frankly, you know, people who have social identities that are associated with systems of power also have a stake in the game, right? Liberation improves the lives of all people, whether you have a socially dominant or a socially oppressed identity. um, in terms of, you know, working with folks who are navigating multiple forms of discrimination, what I really focus on in my work with clients and when I'm working with providers is thinking about what does safety look like for you, and are there ways where we can help you achieve a greater sense of safety? Are there places that feel safe to you? If there aren't, let's see if we can either locate some or establish some, right? And that's where the system is really called into action to ensure that we have those safe spaces. Are there ways that you can keep yourself safe physically or psychologically? And so, depending on what the answer is to that, that will kind of shape what we work on. Are your relationships safe? Do your kind of social communities feel like safe spaces for you? If not, let's think about how we can make that happen for you a little bit better. And it can be really challenging when you're experiencing multiple forms of discrimination at the same time. I mean, we know that folks who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color often experience racism in kind of predominantly white LGBTQ plus spaces, right? We also know that LGBTQ plus folks often experience discrimination in their communities of origin, in faith communities, right? And so there can be a lot of kind of ambivalence and conflict around locating the spaces that feel safest for you. And I don't mean to imply that automatically, if you have more than one identity that's associated with a history of oppression, that, you know, there is no space for you. That's not at all what I mean. But sometimes, you know, we have to really look at what systems of power and prejudice are operating in multiple systems, multiple communities, and how can we make sure that we are really affirming, empowering, and prioritizing the safety of folks who may not be front and center.
And also, I think that the challenge too is in addressing the inequities. I mean, I'm white, I'm a guy, so already I have two privileges going for me. I'm gay, but I try to be cognizant of where my privilege is. And one thing that I'm painfully aware is that, especially as a librarian, you know, we try to make sure that our community has access to all the information that we can provide them. And so, you know, we're very sensitive to making sure that the library is a safe space for everybody. And by that same token, you know, I feel like your work as a psychotherapist is in making sure that, to the degree that we can, that the world is a safe space for everybody. But we all know that people of color, women, people in marginalized communities don't have resources
Mhm.
that the dominant population has.
Mhm.
So, you know, in your work, do you find that it's challenging working with or helping queer people of color, queer minorities? They're already a minority being queer, and now they're like a double minority or triple minority. Um, in your work, do you find that one of the challenges is in trying to address those inequities, like getting the word out that there is help for you? And, you know, I mean, here at the library, we're aware that not everybody has a computer, not everybody has a smartphone. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on like addressing those inequities.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly you're mentioning like folks with smartphones and kind of folks being able to access the resources that the library provides. Obviously, the digital divide is um, really real and really impactful. So, that's certainly one inequity that comes to mind. I also think, one of the keys here is trusting that communities know what their own healing, wellness, and empowerment looks like for them. So for me, as a fellow white person, as a cisgender person, um, I, you know, I don't know what I don't know. I do know some of what I don't know, right? And this is where I think really empowering and partnering with community members is everything. I think about um, at the Department of Mental Health, for example, we have underserved cultural community subcommittees. And these subcommittees are affinity groups that are based on different historically underserved communities. And one of, I'm involved with our LGBTQIA2S subcommittee. And one of the things that we do in that subcommittee that I find so incredibly inspiring is we we really encourage community stakeholders who really kind of run this subcommittee. It's not run by the Department of Mental Health. We kind of, we run the meetings and have liaisons, et cetera. But really they are community run and they are for the community. And subcommittee members will submit proposals for capacity building projects that benefit the LGBTQIA2S community as a whole, or specific intersections within, et cetera. And then community members are able to fulfill these capacity building projects themselves with the support of the Department of Mental Health. So I think part of how we address these inequities is empowering communities to do what we know is best, or what they know is best for themselves.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Um, so you mentioned, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but I saw in some notes that you provided that you practice, what is it, affirmative psychotherapy. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, first let's take the word affirmative. I think the whether you identify as an affirmative psychotherapist or not, I think anybody who is a service provider and works with LGBTQ plus folks, and if you're a service provider, you work with LGBTQ plus folks, is the importance of affirming people for who they authentically are. And that includes affirming the process of identity development, of exploration, of curiosity, of questioning. So when I say affirming someone for who they authentically are, it doesn't mean that they will come to you and know for sure who they authentically are. But folks generally have a sense of who they might see themselves to be or who they want to be. And it is our job to affirm that process and affirm the humanity of the folks that we're working with. There's nothing for us to question or confirm or assign to other people. And I think multiple institutions obviously have a history of doing that, particularly with LGBTQ plus folks. So I think the main tenet of affirmative psychotherapy is affirming, right? Really creating that space and celebrating who we authentically are as a diverse community of people. Within that, of course, we recognize that a lot of folks come to us with some internalized stigma, shame, hatred toward their authentic self or who their authentic self may grow to be. And so part of that work also entails really kind of acknowledging and unpacking a bit what some of those internalized beliefs are, putting them into context. Sometimes it is so incredibly powerful just to say out loud, we live in a society that is incredibly hostile to LGBTQ plus people or to transgender people specifically, or to gay people or bisexual folks specifically, right? Depending who you're talking to. Sometimes it's incredibly powerful just to name that social context. So, it's not that folks are coming in with these questions or negative feelings about themselves, and those questions or feelings are just kind of coming out of nowhere, right? They come from a very real place. And then also explicitly saying who you are is okay, right? And not only okay, but we celebrate how diverse people are and how you love who you love, and who you are in your authentic identity is really just part of the fabric of human diversity overall. And then within that, depending on kind of the the source of pain or what that person is really seeking out of their work in psychotherapy, then we can start to implement specific interventions based on that. So I spoke quite a bit about safety earlier. I think that that's huge in affirmative psychotherapy. So again, kind of looking at where there are opportunities to maximize and ensure safety. And so we think about safety both in the physical and environmental sense. We think about social and relational safety. We think about intrapersonal and emotional safety. Do you have the coping strategies you need to sustainably get through moments of pain, moments of acute distress that are a part of being a human, and also, often come with living with discrimination and oppression in your life? And so what kinds of coping strategies can we help you employ to make sure that you can get through those moments and keep yourself safe? And then really kind of remembering that LGBTQ plus folks are themselves the experts on their own lives, on their community connectedness, on their outness, right? When they come out, if they decide to come out at all, what coming out looks like, to whom are they out, and what they want their lives to look like, really. I think it's up to us to step back from this kind of top down, authoritative, kind of I know best stance around that, particularly with identities that have historically or are currently being pathologized, and really allow people to be the experts in their own lives and their own wellness.
So it sounds like, like affirmative, affirmative, well, psychotherapy in general is really about helping your patients develop their strategies on their own and develop the tools that they need to protect themselves and validate themselves and be able to protect themselves in, like you said, in an increasingly hostile world. I wanted to kind of jump back a little bit. It feels to me like, with all the progress that we've made, although nowadays it doesn't always feel like progress, but we have same-sex marriage, we have um, more gay rights legislation on the books in many states. California is very progressive. Other parts of the country, not so much.
Right.
But if I may be bold and say that it feels to me like transgender is the current um, boogeyman. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it feels like it's people are scared, and they're there's a lot of hostility towards the
Mhm.
transgender community. And, so how do you see, how does that hostility, how do we address it is basically, and how do we address it as friends and allies who know transgender people? And how do we address it as a country? I know that's a huge question, but it just feels to me like that's the next salvo in the anti-LGBT um, legislation that we're seeing today.
Yeah. You know, um, I'm not going to directly answer your question on how we solve it as a country because that's way above my pay grade. But
I know.
but but
As
our
soon as, as soon as
but
I
our
said that,
country,
I thought,
no,
yeah,
it's totally fine. But our country is run by people, right? It's run
yeah,
by individual people. Laws are drafted and passed by individual people. So I do think that there are practices that we can um, put into place as individual people that can really move the needle toward justice and inclusion for folks of all genders, and particularly for trans and non-binary folks. And so one of those things that I said a minute ago is, when someone tells you who they are, believe them, even if they don't look the way that their identity kind of fits in your head, or even if their identity surprises you, or when they tell you who they are, it surprises you. Just believe them and respond in kind. I think putting things into, well, okay, first of all, if I take a step back, um, looking at how deeply entrenched the gender binary is in our society and in our culture. And we know that the gender binary isn't real, right? We know that there are more than two genders. There have been across cultures, across societies, across centuries. And we start to see it. I think it is an impact of colonization, and I think it's an impact of so many other forces of oppression that we can certainly have another conversation about. But knowing that trans identities are not new, and that there are many cultures in society throughout history where trans identities and non-binary identities have been celebrated and accepted and really integrated into society. So I think first we need to take a step back and realize that the gender binary in and of itself is a huge social and cultural bias that we experience. I'll just talk about here in the US. Obviously, we know in many other places across the world. And so what are some little practices that we can start putting into place as individuals to expand our understanding of gender, and of how to affirm people for who they authentically are? So, I think one is, in healthcare, for example, really putting into practice, introducing yourself. Well, this isn't healthcare specific, but in institutions, introducing yourself with your pronouns, right? So doing some reflecting on, what are my pronouns? And everybody has pronouns. Some people don't use pronouns, but you know we have them, or we have a relationship to pronouns at least. And and starting to put into practice introducing yourself with your pronouns, and asking folks that you work with what their pronouns are. For those of us who are cisgender, it may feel like it's not important, or it's something really small, but it demonstrates that we're even thinking about our own gender and putting our own genders into a social context, rather than as an essentially defined aspect of who we are that's been there since birth, because we know that that's not how gender works. Um, it also means expanding access and maintaining access to gender affirming medical care for folks who want it, and really treating that as necessary medical care. It's not elective. It's not, something that's, political. It's been made to be political, but we know that it is necessary for people's health and well-being. So, I think these are just kind of two, one kind of big, increasing access to gender affirming medical care, and something smaller, which is just knowing your pronouns and talking about pronouns with people, but just ways that we can start to reflect on how we've internalized the gender binary as an essential truth, and then take a step back and think, how can I kind of stretch that for myself and know that gender is more expansive, more complex, more beautiful than that, and really affirm folks for who they are when they tell you.
And it feels like that the needle in the country, it's moving. I mean, maybe not quickly enough, but it is moving. For example, the State Department is
Mhm.
offering a third gender option on
Right.
the passport. So, I mean, I think that just speaks volumes about the direction um, that we're going, maybe not quickly enough. Um, because for me, I say, it's cisgender gay man. Transgender is what's new to me, and I imagine what's new to many people. But I feel like, and this is where I feel like part of this is what we have to talk about as a society. It's that I feel like as a gay man, I will not know what it's like to be transgender. I will not know what it's like to be a person of color. But my experience as a gay man gives me some insight into what it's like to be on the outside.
Mhm.
And I feel like when I read the news and I read comments on discussion boards from people that I feel like they don't get it, I wish that there was some way that we could help um, the rest of the world to get it. But I also feel like the battle is with the queer community. It would be nice if the day would come when the queer community didn't have to
Mhm.
explain themselves and justify their existence and just be. But do you feel, so I have two questions for you. I
Mhm.
have more, but two right now. One is, do you have hope and optimism for um, the queer community? And then the second question I have is, what advice would you have for parents, caregivers, and allies of the queer community?
Yeah. Great questions. So, um, I do have hope. I have a lot of hope for the queer community. Um, I also, you know, I appreciate what you're saying about the needle moving. I agree. Of course, it is not moving nearly fast enough. I also think it's important for us to acknowledge that as progress is being made, um, there's also a lot of work that still needs to be done, and there are many ways in which things are not getting better for LGBTQ plus folks and for trans folks specifically. I mean, last year set a record for the number of anti-trans legislations that were introduced in state and local legislatures. And last year also broke the record um, with kind of records being kept by the Human Rights Campaign of trans and gender nonconforming folks who lost their lives to violence. And knowing that most of those folks were Black trans women. So, again, thinking about this intersectionally and recognizing that um, as we are seeing progress, certainly in places like LA or California and, other places across the US, we're also seeing a lot of continued pain and continued opportunities, or not opportunities, but cries out for so much change to be made. So that's one thing that I don't want to leave unsaid. Um, and in terms of adults who are in the lives of LGBTQ plus kids, whether they are as parents or caregivers, family members, teachers, librarians, mental health providers, et cetera. Um, there is there's increasing research that's coming out that really propels my hope forward for how we can really shape a better world for young people. One entity and resource that I really want to share with you is the Family Acceptance Project, which is based out of San Francisco State University. Dr. Gitlin Ryan is the lead investigator there, and they have done some incredible work around identifying what types of behaviors and reactions and responses to a young person's sexual orientation or gender identity, specifically non-heterosexual and or non-cisgender identities, how responses and behaviors can really impact the mental health and overall well-being of those young people over time. And so the way they frame it is it all comes down to behavioral responses. We recognize, of course, that for parents, other family members, caregivers, guardians, teachers, mental health providers, et cetera, there might be feelings of confusion, ambivalence, even anger or sadness or frustration at a young person's kind of authentic disclosure of who they are. And we can definitely hold space for adults to go through that process. And what we really want to emphasize is it is the behavior that the adult implements that really has the impact. So really kind of separating out, and we do this in mental health all the time, separating out thoughts and feelings from behavior. And the Family Acceptance Project has lots of publications that folks can access for free that lay out what are behaviors that are supportive and affirming and promote higher self-esteem, healthy coping behaviors, just overall psychological wellness, and what are those behaviors that are deemed rejecting behaviors that over time can really negatively impact psychological well-being. And what's interesting about what they found and in their conversations with families and caregivers is some of the behaviors that have been deemed rejecting were done with the best of intentions. So for example, a parent is afraid of their child getting bullied at school. And so in an effort to keep that child safe and welcomed into their social circles, they may say, wear different clothes, or maybe you shouldn't put that nail polish on, or maybe you should wear your hair this way instead. I'm saying this because I love you, right? And so even though it is coming from a place of love and care and concern, that is actually a behavior that rejects authentic expression and authentic selfhood. And so I would definitely recommend looking into the Family Acceptance Project for more information about what affirming behaviors, which by the way are talking openly with your child about their sexuality and or gender, welcoming your children's friends who are also LGBTQ plus friends and partners, taking your child to LGBTQ plus events, making sure they have LGBTQ plus role models if you don't have any LGBTQ plus adults in your family. So really kind of looking at what are the ways that we can shape psychological well-being among LGBTQ plus youth. And there is additional research beyond the Family Acceptance Project that really supports that. So I believe it was also the Trevor Project that found in another study they did that LGBTQ plus youth who had at least one supportive adult in their life, not parent necessarily, but one supportive adult. So it could be a teacher, it could be a librarian, it could be a mental health provider, et cetera, were 40% less likely to contemplate suicide. And that's just from one supportive adult, right? Another study that I talk about a lot in the trainings that I do is there was a study that found when trans kids were affirmed for who they were from the time of identity disclosure up through their upbringing, they were as psychologically healthy as their cisgender peers. So remember that really, really like striking and scary statistic I shared at the beginning of our conversation about 40% of trans adults who have attempted to end their life beyond contemplation, who have actually attempted, and those other kind of really stark disparities that we see in mental health outcomes. Imagine those rates really start to go down and even out when we support people for who they are and affirm them from the get-go.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I feel like you know, the main takeaway here is just to know that there's help and that you know, don't be afraid to seek help. I know that mental health is something that the world over struggles with, but it's obviously more acute in the queer community. So I want to thank you, Dr. Gitlin, for taking the time to um, share your thoughts on queer mental health in the ways that we can empower ourselves and and also to be better partners with our queer allies, no matter who we are.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to take some time for some questions. I'll see if we have any. Um, and
I'm
so,
gonna butt in.
yeah,
There are two questions in the chat. The last two things set in the chat are, or I think there's two in there.
no. Let me see. So let's need a minute. So where are the questions?
I can read them. I don't mind doing it. I'll step in real quick. So somebody says, I'm currently reading LGBTQ plus scholarship applications for academic year 2022 to 2023. I'm surprised that the applicants seem to be out of touch with persons such as yourself. By that, I mean local LGBTQ plus leaders and leadership. How do we raise up and out and make visible local role models available to local high schools and colleges? It seems these applicants do not have real world LGBTQ plus role models.
That's a great question. And, that question comes from Bill Sive, who, hi, Bill. I mean, you yourself are another person that young LGBTQ plus people need to know. I mean, you are a local leader in your own right, and then some. How do we raise up out and visible local role models to local high schools and colleges? I think mentorship programs are huge here. I know that the LA LGBT Center has a mentoring program. And I'm sorry that I did not send that to the two of you, David and Martin, with the resources, but I think it's called LifeWorks. And that is a program where young LGBTQ plus folks can pair up with an adult mentor who's a member of the community. So I think that's part of it. I think events like this are part of that. I think one of the gifts of all of us being sent home 2 years ago is that we've had so many more virtual offerings, virtual ways to connect with one another. While of course still recognizing that the digital divide has a huge impact on so many folks, but for folks who are able to kind of connect virtually, I think these platforms like this are a really great way to do that. I'm going to be sitting with that question for a while, Bill, because I think it's really so hugely important. I think social media is maybe not a way for people to connect directly with one another, but certainly there are social media accounts of people who are out and who, whether they use their social media accounts more for educational purposes and or to share, what a joyous and sometimes well curated, authentic LGBTQ plus life can look like. I think that can be hugely affirming for young people. So I think there are many ways to do this. And want to think about more. So I really appreciate your question, Bill.
Dr. Gitlin, we have another question just came in. Um, and the question is, I know it's realized to stop self-isolating. What are safe spaces and what do they look like?
Hmm. So when I think of safe spaces more generally, I think about spaces, well, I've been having conversations in some of the anti-racism work that I've been doing around safe versus brave spaces. So I know I've been talking a lot about safety and safe spaces in here. I also want to introduce the concept of brave spaces. People have differing opinions on what kind of resonates more with them. But, the notion of a brave space is one where, safety is not guaranteed because, for many folks, safety just isn't guaranteed. But we do want to foster a sense of collective bravery to stretch ourselves, stretch our own thinking, and always in the service of fostering an environment that is affirming and welcoming and does not enact harm on anybody that is in that space. Hopefully doesn't enact harm just in general. And, also with the notion that for some people, for people like you and me, David, as two white folks here, right? Spaces are generally safe for us, right? So the notion of a safe space doesn't have as much meaning, but for us to step into a brave space where we are also called to be brave in reflecting on our own power and privilege and how that impacts our lives and how the systems that give us that power and privilege also affect the lives of the folks that we share community with, the folks that we share space with. I think that's a really important aspect of a brave space. And when I think about a safe space and a brave space, I think about one that, again, is welcoming and affirming and leaves room for exploration and questions and dialogue in a way where nobody is put down. People are called in to their own learning and their own connection with one another. And in terms of kind of the specifics of where to find a brave space or what a safe space or a brave space really looks like, I think that really depends on the individual and what feels safe for them. Who is in that space? Where physically is that space? Is it online? Is it in person? Are you with a small group? Are you with a large group? Are you doing something together? Are you listening? So I think there are many aspects that make a space feel safer or less safe. But I do hope that we can all really cultivate brave spaces.
I actually have a question, Dr. Gitlin, that popped in my head when we were talking earlier about trauma. Like queer, it's my impression that queer people, just by virtue of being in a queer community and queer and different experience trauma. And you mentioned something earlier about like the ways that we deal with the way that we cope.
Mm-hmm.
And so addiction and substance abuse is one way that a lot of people cope. And my impression is that addiction and substance abuse is high in the queer community.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind taking a minute to address that and what that means?
Yeah. So you're right. Problematic substance use does happen at higher rates in LGBTQ plus communities than it does in cisgender and heterosexual communities. I think a lot about the minority stress model, which I described earlier as a way of understanding why that happens, and a trauma-informed framework as well to think about it. And so, you know, if we kind of take a step back and we think about, well, we think about safe spaces, right? At least toward the beginning of, you know, what was then referred to as the gay liberation movement, the spaces where people were able to convene with one another in a way that we now know wasn't entirely safe, you know, certainly not from, you know, law enforcement and mobs, et cetera. But, you know, places where people could come together, often, not exclusively, of course, but they were often places where people were drinking, right? And so I think that you know, that is both a way for people to connect. And of course, we know that with alcohol specifically, it is a very kind of promoted practice in our society, commercially and culturally. Um, and, you know, so it was a way for folks to connect with one another. It is a mode of coping, a mode of feeling better or feeling good that is socially sanctioned. Um, and it works in the short term, right? And of course, not everybody uses substances, not everybody convenes with one another in spaces where substances are used. But I think there is both a social context to this and also um, and also kind of a trauma-informed way of looking at how and why people use substances. And that over time, what starts off as something that makes sense and feels good and is easily accessible can, without the introduction or integration of other more sustainable coping strategies, that, you know, substance use can become something else over time. So, I mean, that's one of the ways that I understand that particular psychiatric inequity within our community. Um, and, you know, I think there's also a lot to be said for the ways that we continue to promote connection and healing within our community, and how much alcohol and other substances are kind of a part of that messaging, while at the same time we talk about how this is a problem in our community and you know, something that we want to get rid of, but we're not necessarily cultivating a society that promotes holistic wellness in other ways. And so again, kind of thinking about trauma-informed societies and trauma-informed practices for healing. Those are some of the things I think about.
Wow. So, Dr. Gitlin, you've given us a lot to digest and think about. I really want to thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts and answer some questions. I also wanted to thank everybody who's here for joining us. Um, Martin will be sending out an email with listing the resources. Am I right about that, Martin?
That is correct. I would like to plug a couple of things real quick before everyone leaves.
Yeah.
So we will be having a program with the San Gabriel Valley APIP flag that will be on Wednesday, May 25th. You can register for that at our virtual programs website, which is, I'm going to throw it in the chat after I finish talking because I can't talk and type at the same time. But that'll be May 25th from 6 to 7. So if you don't know what PFLAG is, it's a support group for, or the San Gabriel Valley API PFLAG specifically is a support group for Asian Pacific Islander LGBTQ plus people, their parents, families, and allies. It's going to be an interesting program for sure. We also have a bunch of stuff coming up for Pride Month. We're going to interview a scorpion scholar, a queer scorpion scholar. I'm very excited about that program. We are going to do some book talks and some short stories. We're going to have a comics program, a bunch of cool stuff coming up. Check it out. lacountylibrary.org/pride is our website. David's involved in some of that. I'm involved in some of that. It's going to be a good time. And yes, I will also be sending out an email at the end of this with a bunch of resources that Dr. Gitlin has so kindly shared with us. So there will be an email coming soon from me. All right, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you, Dr. Gitlin. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I hope you all learned something from it. I know I did. So again, on behalf of LA County Library, I thank you for joining us. Good night.
Thank you so much. It's great talking with you.
Bye.